Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar of the Illicit Trade Group, supported by the Rudolf Agricola School, may I say, for Sustainable Society, on the topic, the politics of poverty, identity politics and electoral competition in Recife, Olinda, Brazil. This webinar contains a presentation by Flávio Eiró. We are very happy that he is here with us today to speak about this topic and to inform us about his research on this topic. Flávio is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Arts. Minorities and multilingualism is the more specific section where he is located at the University of Groningen. And he has a long-lasting history in research on ethnographic aspects in Brazil, has published widely on various issues surrounding politics, as well as poverty, anti-poverty poverty politics, and policy implementation. He also teaches as well, of course, in the Faculty of Arts, and has a focus on race and racism. We're very happy that he's here with us today. He's promised to talk about a couple of examples, cases, and not to spend too much time on the more boring theoretical sides of his research. Of course, perhaps we will find another occasion for that in the future. But I think that it is very well for a more interdisciplinary oriented talk and an audience, that we get a bit of a feeling of the actual things going on, and what is there, what can you tell us about that, and how should we understand all of that. I should further say that we are going to record this lecture, and after the lecture there's plenty of time for questions and answers. We're not going to record the discussion, so just so you know, we only record this part of the lecture. So welcome to everyone. I would say, without further ado, Flávio, the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you very much, Pim. That's very nice to be invited to come here and talk to you, to our guests, to your students as well. That makes a very nice group. So it was also with that challenge in mind to talk to people from different backgrounds and coming from different places, that I decided then to focus on the very empirical aspects of my research. That means that I make some references to very sometimes controversial or complex theoretical discussions, but I'm not going to go too deep into them, even if the way I approach my topics will kind of will naturally bring up those discussions. And I invite you later, if you do want to talk more theoretically, we can definitely do that at the end. But because I have so many stories to tell you, I'm going to focus on them, and there's some photos, and my goal is to take you on a little trip on my last fieldworks in Brazil. So that's my goal, and that's how I'm going to start as well, because I have let's see, I'm going to start my presentation here. Can you see my, let's see, you should be able to see my full slide at the moment?
Yes, perfect, thanks.
Okay, perfect. So I'm entitled this presentation, Politics of Poverty. And the politics of poverty is, of course, a very broad a very broad theme, right? That has to do with how poverty and several issues surrounding poverty are incorporated, discussed, debated, defined within the realm of politics. And today, of course, I'm not going to, by far, not really come close to discuss, to integrate all of that, especially also not which place poverty takes in Brazilian politics, but I'm going to focus on one place, and that is these two cities called Recife and Olinda in the northeast side of Brazil. If the names sound a bit familiar to you, especially to the Dutch public, that is because Olinda, specifically in that area around Recife, was held by the Dutch back in the 17, 18 something, I don't remember now exactly. For about 30 years, the Dutch held their fort there against the Portuguese colonizers, and then later they left. But it is then, for a period of time, this was a Dutch colony, actually, a little part of Brazil. Very, very interesting piece of history where, by the way, Groningen had a very strong role there. Province of Groningen at the time had the main responsibility, let's say, with that colony. But that's for another moment. And then we come to the second part, which is identity politics and electoral competition. So how is it that identity politics, the way some politicians make use of identitarian politics, of certain identity markers to promote their political claims, to gain legitimacy, to gain votes, to gain voters. How does that issue comes into electoral competition with local electors, local politicians in those two cities? That is the context. So here are some guiding questions that I'm interested in. First of all, how does the political landscape reorganize itself after a rupture, a crisis? For those who are a little bit familiar, we have in Brazil since a couple of years, since 2019, a new president called Bolsonaro, and he's a typical far-right extremist politician that flirts a lot with authoritarian rule, and is at the moment sitting with Putin in Russia, by the way. But it's also another story. And the election of Bolsonaro in 2018 was was a rupture in Brazil. Nobody expected that. Political movements, political parties didn't really see that coming until the very end. Bolsonaro had no actual political support. And although this is a kind of a long story, it did represent a rupture that started some kind, or not started, but it was the apex of a political crisis that Brazil had been experiencing the years before that. So in that scenario where a new political force comes in and changes the game, so to say, there's a trickle-down effect where parties, movements, basically everyone involved or somehow involved in political life needs to rethink their position, reorganize their strategies, and start strategizing again how to gain votes that were lost, how to gain positions that were lost then with this new organization. So that was the context that got me interested. In that sense, the bit larger interest is how do politicians imagine and perform politics. In my area, I come from anthropology and sociology. There's a lot of work showing how voters relate to politics. How do they choose who they're going to vote for? How they relate to this interaction with politics. Do they need interactions, like personal interaction with politics or not? But there's very few research showing the other side of politics, so to say, which is from the perspective of the politicians, really from their first-person perspective. It's really not so from a statistical perspective, from a global perspective. But if you talk to them, if you actually go and try to understand what are their strategies, and how do they even think about politics, and how do they relate to their voters, there's very few research done in that using that perspective. That's my interest in these last years. Which comes to the third question: how do politicians interpret the ways the urban poor engage with politics? Then it comes more specific, right? So how is it that they project their thinking into politics, into how their voters will think of politics, and how they respond to that? So it's a bit of a game of expectations, but it's also a communication, interaction there that take place that shapes those expectations, that will tell them, I think my voters want that because that's the kind of demand that gets to me, and how do they position themselves in relation to those demands? So that's something that interests me as well. And at the end, which comes to the part of identity politics, who can claim progressiveness, and what does that mean? Which politician is allowed, so to say, or has the legitimate claim to claim their identity as black, or as coming from the favelas, the slums of Brazil, and using that identity, or their religious identity, by the way, to garner votes. So that strategy, let's put it like that, is also contested. It's not everyone who does that, first of all, and it's not everyone who can do that. And I say can in the sense that voters will buy that, voters will see that as not being an opportunistic claim, and how do the other actors, the competitors, see those claims? So this is kind of the frame that's behind here, right? Then I made a slide as well, specifically focused for today and for the public that I have today as well. There was a part of my abstract that I said not so legal practices, and I saw that Pim liked that term, so I wanted to develop a little bit more here, right? I'm mainly, when I'm talking about relationship between voters and politicians, there's something that is at play here, and that's what we're calling personal relationships. And personal relationships, and this really interpersonal, right? Knowing a politician or a candidate or someone who works for a candidate and engaging those relationships, that kind of interaction play a central role in structuring political life in Brazil, and especially in the region where I'm talking about. This dynamic often is characterized in the literature as clientelism. I don't know if you heard about it before. It has to do a little bit with vote buying, the way somebody can exchange votes for in a transaction, basically. It can be monetary transaction, but can also be just goods or promises, or I'm not sure. But this kind of transactional interaction usually gets the name of vote buying. Also in legal aspects, in Brazil at least, and I know many countries also in Latin America, and I think also the United States, they legally classify vote buying, and they define it, and it is a crime, an electoral crime. Clientelism is a little bit trickier, because clientelism refers to a relationship that is established between a voter and a politician or their representatives. And it can include vote buying, in the sense that it can include an interaction where there's a transaction going on, vote for something, but often it doesn't. Often it's more, as I said before, a personal relationship, long-term, based on long-term interests as well, where sometimes some, let's say, displays of loyalty have to be proven or have to be shown. And these can be in the form of goods or benefits or money that can be given to someone, usually from the politician to the poor voters, but can also be the other way around, by the voters showing their loyalty and their political support to those candidates. And I explicitly frame in that way because in most times it's not really about the vote itself, because voting in many of our democracies is a secret act. You cannot really prove that you voted for someone or not. But most important than that is the display of support, that you, for example, decorate the front of your house with some flyers, posters, that you campaign for someone, that you actually work in a campaign of someone. This is also part of this kind of economy of social ties, of friendships, of relationships that are established between those two parties, politicians, their agents, and voters on the other side. So how do you make the distinction between what is normal and what is deviant political behavior? This is kind of my interest here. And I want to make that complicated in a way for us to say, because it's easy in a way to refer to the law and to say, okay, in Brazilian law we have this and that as definition, and the rest is kind of gray area. But of course, laws come from somewhere as well, and that's my interest here. What kind of social values and norms frame those interactions, and how do they match with the laws? So, for example, my third point, vote buying is not really considered immoral per se in Northeast Brazil, even if some forms are illegal. And I say per se because it depends. It depends in how, in which context, in the context of which relationship as well, what is being exchanged, what is being promised or given. All this compose some kind of a moral economy of those interactions that are way more complicated than the legal definition that we have in Brazil, and also the way other politicians or the media or the public opinion in general would see those. Someone who's not involved in those relationships might see them in a very stigmatized way. This is partially because academia as well has treated those interactions as a form of underdevelopment. That's what I say in the first part, in the last part there, right? The belief that this personalized political practices, they testify to civic and political underdevelopment. We have a very long-lasting literature in the field, showing, kind of making that argument that that this is a step, let's say, a prehistorical or a more underdeveloped form of doing politics, and sometimes an immoral form of doing politics that is usually associated to poor voters. And that's something that I want to start problematizing here as well with this presentation. Here's just a quick overview. You have there the place where I did my fieldwork. Of course, that state there that's highlighted, that's the state of Pernambuco, where Recife and Olinda are part of. The state itself should be at least, I don't know, maybe 2 times the size of the Netherlands, so don't take that too seriously. I did my research in 2 little cities, or not little, because Recife is the capital of the state, in the coast there. And I did ethnographic research. That means that I spent months and end with those politicians, working with them, no, not working with them, but closely with them, doing their campaigns as well, interviewing them over and over, and most often not really interviewing in a formal setting, but just going for following them in their campaign activities, and then sometimes combine that with interviews. And I did that with politicians and their teams as well in 2 elections in Brazil, in 2018 and 2020. And I'm hoping that in a few months, in 2022 now, in October, we have another round of elections. I'm hoping to go there and finalize this cycle of 3 elections so that I can do something with those 3 rounds of field work. This is just a quick overview for you to have an idea what I'm going to talk about later. This is Olinda's Carnival, one of the most famous in Brazil. Not as big as the one in Rio or even Salvador. Maybe some of you have heard about it. But Olinda is kind of the third most famous there. And it's a little bit different. It's kind of a street type of carnival, but very popular. A lot of Brazilians from all over the country travel there during Carnival, which is in a month, by the way, or maybe even less. But due to COVID, it's not going to happen, not like that at least. And in the main photo, you can see there at the end, that's Recife there. So you have Olinda here in the first plane, and then in the back you have Recife. So they're very close cities, about 20 minutes car ride, and you can get to the other. And Recife, as you can see, it's a very big city, very urban, while Olinda is a bit more of a small town, so to say, focused on Carnival. Like the whole economy as well of the country, of the city, goes around Carnival, and this is a big part of social life, but also of political life, and that's where we're going to get to in a bit. You have a little bit of context here as well. In 2020, I did field work there, but as you can imagine, my field work was very limited because of COVID pandemic. It was also very politicized, the way different levels of government were responding to the pandemic. You had, for example, prohibition of campaign gatherings just before the elections with more than 20 people. So there's a lot of focus on online campaigning. Some politicians would stroll through the residential neighborhoods and hand out flyers, but not really be able to, gather and make big meetings. You had these empty streets and pretty much of a crippled economy around the election. That is also very important. In every small city in Brazil, election time is a moment where the economy also gets a boost of an influx of resources that will employ people temporarily, of course, but still. It's an important moment in social life as well. And in this case, in 2020, this was limited a lot. So here I want to start a bit more in the context, and for that, I want to introduce you to a notion, an idea that I came across a lot in Brazil. It's this idea of offer service. In Portuguese, we say prestar serviço. But to offer service is a bit of a not the perfect translation, because prestar serviço can be to come to aid of someone, to give support, or just to be at someone's service. So it's something that is very broad. I had never heard this term in a political electoral context until I started this research. So it's a very much local term, but of course that reflects an idea that I've seen in other parts of Brazil as well. But just I quite like the term itself, so I'm going to work a little bit with it here with you. So it refers in this context of politics to services offered by elected representatives to their constituency or potential constituency if they want to conquer some new votes. And it takes the form of small favors or services to be brokered. So it can be, for example, someone is in need of of a wheelchair, or a food basket because someone is in a very difficult situation, or an ambulance maybe to take someone in a faraway corner of the city to the center. So it mixes a bit distribution of goods that often have a private source, so it's really from the politician's pocket, so to say. But sometimes it also can be services, public services that are broked by these politicians because they have better access to the state machine, and they can speed things up, so to say. Politicians would then explain to me that this type of relationship focused on offering services would create a relationship of dependency between politicians and poor voters. So here's a quote I want to bring to you. This relationship of dependency exists, so there are whole families there are neighborhoods and such, and many times you are, let's say, you are someone who offers assistance for 4 years. A counselor is often that. He's a prestador de serviço, a service provider. He does not legislate, he does not oversee government, he only offers service to the community. He uses the power he has for that. And this is Fernando saying. He was a former councilman, but still a very active politician working for other elected politicians. And he was mainly complaining here of the fact that when he was a councillor, like a local deputy, he couldn't do the work that he actually thought he would do or he wanted to do, the work that he considered to be more noble work. But he was caught up in this service provision. Day after day, he would be swamped with demands from his voters, of promises maybe that he made while campaigning, or promises that someone made in his name maybe. But he would have to come to aid of these voters, and that would honestly annoy him quite a bit. He didn't like that, but it was something that he saw that he had to do. And what he refers to as dependency means a bit. He was referring to the fact that if he doesn't do that, he doesn't get elected again. So he needs to do it in a way. So he cannot just shut the door and stop that from happening, right? Other politicians would adapt then. So for example, they would come up with a strategy so they wouldn't have to be swamped by those demands, but still they had to do something. So they would rely, for example, on community leaders for brokering. So they would distribute resources to those community leaders and let those community leaders handle the more day-to-day demands. This was something that's quite normal. Or, for example, they would only help organizations and never individuals. So here, for example, is another state councillor that explained to me how that happened. So she says, what we agreed here in the office was that since the first term, we will not respond to individual demands. Of course, you make gestures of solidarity. You have to. For example, this week I'll buy a wheelchair for a person who since the first term is supporting us. The woman has cancer, started chemotherapy. She's very weak, can't walk. I enrolled her to receive public assistance, but the institution said she's in 5th place, and lung cancer doesn't wait in 5th place. So Beatriz, who is this state councillor, so a bit higher level that politician from the Workers' Party, left-wing, identifies as left-wing, had a lot of trouble dealing with those individual demands because this would be a little bit it would be kind of against her ethics of politics. Fernando, the one before, he came from a center-wing, center party, and he was not too much concerned about the ideological aspect of providing those services, but he was more concerned with the fact that he couldn't really do the more legislative work that he wanted to do. Beatriz was a bit bothered by this idea of individually helping someone and not collectively, which she saw as more the way that her party and herself would do politics, as a collective group, social class-based action. So that's how she had to kind of find that middle ground where she would make some exceptions and thus pay, for example, for a wheelchair, probably out of her own pocket, although she didn't tell me that. But at the same time, she had to refuse some other requests, right? So those two cases then brings me to this idea of how politicians see and interpret the poor people's politics, right? So for example, Beatriz would add and say, people don't understand. They think we need to be on the streets the whole time. So she's saying here that her voters wanted to see her a lot. So for her to be in the neighborhoods and come to them and understand her demands. And she complained about it because she thought that they didn't understand how much work entailed her position. Meetings and assemblies and visits to all sorts of official instances. And yeah, people didn't understand, in her opinion, that she couldn't really be with them all the time, seeing their demands. Fernando, for example, would then add that if he refused to provide service, he would be labeled as elitist, as someone who does not care for the poor, and that's why he could not really refuse those demands, so to say. So politicians then, a lot of those politicians from the center and left that I met, they would complain about the disappearance of the conscious vote or an ideological vote, someone who votes for a party because they support a certain ideology or a certain opinion about a certain subject. So they would look a bit with nostalgia as well at the time when families would gather behind a name. This idea of loyalty that could be personal loyalty in a way for a politician that does good work, but also party loyalty, right? There was a bit of a mixed nostalgia there regarding past times where people would be a little bit more conscious about their work and not just reacting to their capacity of provide services or not. That was one of their concerns, right? Their main concerns. This ties then to what was happening at that moment, especially in 2018, when Bolsonaro got elected, because there was a lot of resentment of the poor for voting far right, for voting for Bolsonaro. And here, just want to make clear, the poor in Brazil, the lower classes, didn't vote that much for Bolsonaro. They didn't support Bolsonaro that much, at least not proportionately. The higher classes disproportionately supported Bolsonaro. You have cities or places where among higher classes you have 90 or 80% of support of Bolsonaro, while among the poor this was much, much lower. But still, even though it was much lower, we cannot say that the poor didn't vote for Bolsonaro and that Bolsonaro was only elected with the vote of the middle classes or the rich. No, there was actually a significant amount of poor people who voted for Bolsonaro. And we could see that in the streets as well. This was not something hidden. We could see that in the way people also put up flyers and banners of Bolsonaro in front of their houses, also in the slums and the poorest neighborhoods of those cities. So there was a bit of resentment there, especially from the left-wing parties that had governed the country for so long and had a lot of popularity among the poor. Why then? Why they would go and vote for the antithesis of what they represented? And a lot of, when I would push them for explanations, why they thought that happened, a lot of times it would come down to an idea that they didn't do enough of that service provision, that they didn't do enough what the poor actually wanted them to do. Of course, if you ask the right wing, especially by the time when the left was in power, this was exactly the opposite. The opposition parties to the left, to the Workers' Party, were complaining a lot that the left wing was doing what they would call assistencialist politics, that would be distributing too many benefits and not really being responsible in the way they spent state public money, so to say. But this is how local politicians would see it. They really blame the fact that they didn't get more votes, or that Bolsonaro got more votes, because they didn't do enough of this service provision, which for me reads a bit as a proxy for populist politics, right? So Bolsonaro, for example, didn't have the resources. He was not in position to actually do that. So he didn't gain those votes by replacing that service provision, far from that. But in those politicians' view, he did that by offering a type of politics or a vision of the future of the country that was populist, that would, for example, focus too much on immediate solutions that were not really solving the problems of the structural problems. So one example, just to illustrate what I'm saying, problem of violence would be then solved by giving everybody the right to own guns. That is still Bolsonaro's narrative, right? Discourse. So this was seen by left-wing politics and also center and even center right-wing politics as populist, because this doesn't solve anything, and this cannot even be done at large scale, but still would get the interest of a lot of people because of this immediate feeling of solving their own problems. But this is just an illustration. Now I want to bring you back to the local context and a little bit further in time. I mean, back to 2020. In 2020, when I was there, I was there to see the re-election of the mayor. And so here, let me tell you a little bit about the mayor. The mayor is called Lupercio, and you can see that there is a Professor Lupercio, and professor there in Portuguese can be both university professors, but also teachers, high school or secondary or primary school teachers. And that was Lupercio's profession until he became a politician. In 2016, Lupercio ran for mayor of Olinda, that beautiful city that I showed you, and he was running solo without party support or no coalitions, only his small party, which in Brazil is almost suicide. Doesn't really happen often. You need large coalitions in order to run and have a chance. But after some details that it's not really worth bothering you here with, he managed to get elected, and really against all the odds. People barely knew who he was at the city level. He was a very local, small-time politician that had no expression. Also, he was a councillor for a little while, but nobody really. He was not a big figure in the city, right? But he runs against a large left coalition and a right-wing coalition, and he managed to win. And once he wins, and that's what matters the most now, he faces a lot of resistance from the elites, first of all, because he was original from one of the largest favelas in Olinda. And he never really hid that, and he comes across also as someone from lower classes. He doesn't hide that. And also, even because of his race as well, because he's a black person, it is very easy for the elites to identify him as coming from lower classes. So there is some resistance there. And second, there was a lot of resistance also from the left because they were afraid that Lupercio, they were afraid of his ostensive use of his evangelical identity. Evangelicals in Brazil are majoritarily among the lower classes. So people from higher classes that are usually or from traditional Protestant churches or most often from Catholic churches, there's a bit of a stigma around evangelical churches, right? So the way that Lupercio was using his evangelical identity during the campaigns made some people a little bit resistant. So once he got elected, there was a lot of fear here what would happen. One of the main fears was that he would go after Carnival. That's why I added the photo of Carnival here again, because Carnival in Olinda is associated with black culture. So the cultural sector as a whole is very much left-wing leaning, supports left-wing candidates traditionally, and they are a very strong political force. If those big groups, big organizations support one candidate or the other, they can make a difference. And that's why for a long time, Olinda was ruled by the left basically in the last 20 or 30 years. Lupercio, coming from the right, mobilizing a conservative evangelical identity and political discourse, got some people afraid. But then in 2020, by 2020, he had already proven that he was not going to go after Carnival. He was not an enemy of the cultural sector. Actually, he supported Carnival more than previous administrations had done. He offered new headquarters for some important cultural institutions. He made very important material improvements in low-income neighborhoods, such as hospitals, pavement of roads, and so on. And there comes accusations of vote buying again, that he was doing this kind of too much of a populist / service provision type of politics. So the opposition started mobilizing also that type of discourse against him. But he tapped into a huge feeling of despondency among the left, among the cultural sector towards the left. The cultural sector then realizes that if Lupercio, coming from the right, being an evangelical, is doing so much for the cultural sector, Why hasn't the left all those years had shown us that kind of support if we had supported them, worked for them, and done so much for them? So there was this feeling of despondency, and that's why in 2020, when Lupescu is running for re-election, there's unconditional support for him, and he gets re-elected very, very easily with a very high, I think 65% of votes in one round, which is very uncommon because we often have several candidates for this kind of position, such as mayor. So it was really a very, very easy win that he took. During the election, I could see him mobilizing a lot that discourse and very much materializing in this quote here that I have at the end. I am black and I am evangelical and nobody can take away a part of me. So this was him responding to that kind of criticism that some maybe enemies, political enemies would be making of him, saying that because he's evangelical, he would go after the cultural sector. But then he mobilizes also his blackness to show that he also belongs to that part of the cultural heritage of the city, and he would never go after the cultural sector and carnival because of his origins as well. So that's how kind of he settled that tension in a way by mobilizing his identity, coming from lower classes, being from a slum, from a favela, and being black himself. So that I wish I would had the time to show some of his speeches as well, where he would really make a complex combination of those two to make sure, well, he ticks the right boxes, so to say, right? And that has been proven very successful. Of course, there's some tension here as well. Left-wing candidates see him, his claims to blackness and his humble origins as instrumental and not really reflecting what they should, a commitment to progressive politics. So I've talked to many candidates, political candidates from the left, who were running against him or in the parties against him, and they would really be at a loss in a way. They really couldn't make sense of why people were buying his discourse because it was, in their opinion, shallow. It wouldn't really be an honest discourse. And of course, you can imagine that I would also be puzzled by that, and I pushed them a lot to say, why is it shallow? Because in the back of my head, I had already done many interviews, for example, with the cultural sector, and they were very happy with his actual politics. And there was this idea that, well, he's not really committed to the full range of progressive politics. So, for example, because he's evangelical and his support base is also evangelical, he hasn't done much to advance LGBTQ rights in the city. And that would be something that would then challenge his legitimacy to claim progressiveness in a way, right? Even though he never really claimed progressiveness, he was just claiming his own identity. And that's when things get interesting, right? They would then target his support of carnival industry and the poor as populist, which then refers back to that idea of service provision, right? So the left and center, well, basically all the other politicians that were not in his party would then complain that the reason why he has so much support is because he does some kind of easy politics, to just give people what they want very easily, but not really solve the structural problems of the city. That's the main criticism that has to come behind, that has to follow such a criticism, because you cannot really target directly saying, well, he's supporting the carnival industry. That's good, everybody agrees. Well, he's helping the poor. That's good, everybody agrees. Then what's the problem? The problem then is that these claims to his identity are shallow. They're not over-encompassing progressive politics, and because it doesn't really focus on the structural issues of the city. So they do not recognize the representation effect that he has among the poor in the cultural organization. They do not understand it or validate the fact that he is who he is, has an importance for those political actors, for those groups, right? They cannot do that also because among that left, among that party, this is not everywhere, but at least in Olinda, those left-wing parties, and especially not the center parties, they do not have candidates that can claim the same origins, the same humble origins from the slums of Olinda. They do not have, actually, I'm thinking now, they do not even have someone who is identified as real black, the way Lupescu is. So that is one of the conflicts here. And to conclude then, my last minute here, there are some thoughts that are behind this, right? That I wish you join me by reflecting here. So while these politicians complain about poor voters' material interests and disinterest with the real politics, identity politics seems to be framing the political discussion in a way that it hasn't done before. Because for the first time, a politician that is not from the left is mobilizing racial discourses and origins on from the origins with the lower classes to push further their position as right-wing candidates as well, as evangelicals as well. They're combining something that is not often done in Brazil, the combination between blackness and evangelical politics, because remember here, blackness is something that is the black movement, political movement in Brazil is associated to the left. So evangelicals, even if they would be black, they wouldn't mobilize that identity as something important for their politics, but they would instead mobilize their evangelical identity, their commitment to conservative politics. So labels such as clientelism, vote buying, service provision, identity politics, their claims to blackness, they are used as reference points by all these actors to guide political competition. And that was something that I hope I could show you, that these things, these concepts, these ideas, they are important. But perhaps the most important for me is to show that those reference points, they need to be understood in their context. There is a local moral economy of political resources and political discourses as well that need to be understood in their local expressions. Such ideas, such as clientelism and even identity politics, have a very wide reach, and we see them in different contexts, but they can take such a specific dimension when you look at local realities that when I present this research for other Brazilians who have never been there in Olinda or in Recife, or even haven't followed this specific struggle, they are taken aback and they don't really see, they see this as something very unique somehow. That is only to show that those ideas, and for that reason, I want to make that link also to claims of corruption and how actors mobilize some of those terms as accusation, but sometimes as justification for their acts. All this variation is important for us to understand when we are dealing with politics and when we are dealing with concepts that can take such a different local meaning, so to say. That was it. I hope you enjoyed, and I'm going to stop the presentation so we can have the discussion.